Hi, Joseph Benoit Squires from Well Prepared. We'd like to ask the question, do you have what it takes to survive? Today we're going to talk about what you would need to survive and be well prepared to survive for 3 weeks. This is a little bit of an extended period of time as opposed to what we normally talk about, which is a 72-hour kit or a 3-day survival period. 3 weeks could occur for a variety of reasons. Besides what we've already talked about in 3-day periods, a lot of the natural hazards that you might encounter. The reasons why you might need to be prepared to survive for 3 weeks for an extended disaster would be things like climate change, drought, famine, pandemics, recessions, and civil unrest. So let's talk about climate change to start. This is a hot topic around the world right now, and especially in America. We've got a lot of people and a lot of scientists that are working around the clock to figure out what the exact extent of the damage from climate change is. Things like El Nino, things like the melting polar caps. We see a lot of mass animal deaths that are taking place. To get to the bottom of it, climate change has pretty much gone from science fiction to an everyday reality. Global warming is official. Mass animal deaths are on the rise worldwide. Diseases and pests are incubated and spread during unseasonable periods. So whereas normally you might not see a lot of mosquitoes during a certain time of the year, now we do. Alaska recently said that the recent drought and the recent wet weather and warm weather has been a breeding ground for things like mosquitoes that can spread all kinds of different diseases. So it's a pretty dangerous situation that we put ourselves in, where the ecosystem fails and predatory pests are able to flourish as opposed to the normal animals and flora and fauna. Crops fail and forests burn. The cycle of destruction is downward and swift. The circle of life is choking and sputtering towards destruction. Recent reports from scientists say that the ocean's circle of life is on the brink of catastrophe and collapse. Literally, we're seeing coral bleaching on a worldwide level. Melting polar ice caps not only affect forests and affect ocean temperatures and ocean weights and pressure on tectonic plates, but some of the sensitive ecosystems that are in the area of the polar ice caps are susceptible to this climate change. They're seeing not only their environment destroyed, but the environment of all the things that they eat and thrive on destroyed. So we see polar bears like this, which was very big in the news, that are completely emaciated and on the brink of death, starving to death. These are animals that normally at this time of year are filling up on fat to survive throughout the colder winter months. But now they're left with nothing to eat and nowhere to go because their entire environment is destroyed. A couple of quick facts about climate change. Carbon dioxide levels in the air are at their highest in over 650,000 years. 9 out of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2000. Recent years have been the hottest. Arctic summer sea ice shrank to its lowest level on record. Greenland ice loss doubled between 1995 and 2005 and is on an upward trend ever since then. Many animal deaths are on the rise. We're seeing mass animal deaths of a variety of different species, not only fish and whales and dolphins and crabs, but we're even seeing birds on the land. Mass animal deaths in the tune of thousands to hundreds of thousands that are completely unexplained. So we're seeing whole ecosystems being destroyed. A couple of causes of crop loss. 55% of crop loss is caused by drought, 16% by excess moisture, 12% by frost and freeze, 8% by hail, 3% by wind, 2% by disease, 2% by flood, and 1% by insects. So some of the biggest things that cause crop loss worldwide would be drought and excessive moisture. Those are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. You'd wonder why a lack of water could cause crop loss and then excess moisture could cause crop loss. Drought, we know why. The plants need water to survive, but excess moisture can actually drown the plants out. You might have noticed this if you have a green thumb and you do any gardening. If you water your plant too much, it can be killed, it can die. So unseasonable rain due to climate change in an area where farming has taken place can actually cause the plants to be killed off. So it doesn't take just drought. It can be too much rain or flooding in the same case that will cause crops to fail. So let's talk a little bit more about drought. The worst droughts in U.S. history occurred during the 1930s and 50s, known as the Dust Bowl years. Droughts lead to significant economic damages and societal changes. We see not only food prices rise, but Even jobs are reduced because there's nothing to do. The food's not growing, it's not being produced, it's not being distributed. So there's a lack of jobs, there's a lack of economic stimulus, there's a lack of food where people are literally starving. The worst droughts we've seen in America don't compare to some that we've seen around the world. We were able to pull together, and we were more diversified in our farming and agricultural operations. But worldwide and historically, some droughts have led to mass population deaths, where millions and millions of people have starved to death. In particular, relief and health agencies became overburdened, and many local communities, banks, and other institutions had to close. Millions were homeless and hungry, without jobs, without food, without resources. This is one of those cases where you want to have at least 3 weeks worth of provisions. That's going to be enough to take care of you and your family while you get out of Dodge. In many cases, droughts are regional. They're very specific in the area that they are, and you can move somewhere else where there's better economy, better ecology, more resources, and more opportunity. So you need enough food, enough water, enough medications, enough supplies to last 3 weeks and get to an area where it's not drought-stricken. A lot of farmers suffer the worst from drought. These are farmers that are already largely in debt and living paycheck to paycheck. So a drought can actually wipe out a farm operation completely and put them out of business. The worst part about that is that when the weather, the weather system resumes to normal, that farm is completely out of business and there's no more operations taking place there. A couple of facts about droughts. Because of climate change, southwestern USA is soon to believed to be facing the worst drought in over 1,000 years. So going back pretty much as far as they've been recording, as far as they can dig and look at the history of droughts, the worst that they've ever seen, we're in the middle of right now in the southwestern US. California is expected to be facing this current drought for at least the next 100 years. So this is a big farming belt, big farm operation in the US where millions and millions of people live right now, are expected to see the worst drought that they've ever seen in history continue for more than 100 years. What does that mean to us? It means that we may soon see a mass exodus out of California, where people are no longer able to survive or subsist on the current ecology. And they may be looking to move to different states to find work, to find jobs, to find food, to find resources. Because now these once rich areas that survived off of all the natural resources they had have no natural resources. They have no water, and these people are going to look for somewhere else to go. So look for that in the next couple years, maybe in the next couple decades. You may be seeing an exodus of people moving out of drought-stricken California into areas where they can find more work and more resources. A mega drought is basically a drought that lasts more than 3 decades. Many US states face droughts that could last 20, 30, or even 40 years. In the case of California, the worst droughts that we're seeing, accompanied by massive wildfires, are predicted to last at least the next 100 years. It's a good illustration of the drought areas in the US. The areas that are most at risk for drought, you can see that there's a little key over here that mentions the exceptional droughts down to dry or anomaly droughts based on color. So if you live in any of these states, mostly in the western US, and you're at risk of drought, consider the implications that could affect you, not only in the first 3 days or 3 weeks of a major drought, but years in the future as the economy in that area starts to fail and starts to falter. And things become more expensive or less accessible. You need to be ready to move to a different area and get out of Dodge. Famine is something that often results from drought. So first it starts with climate change. The climate has changed in one area, a place or a city or a town that was once a haven for development that had tons of food and irrigation and agriculture now is a barren wasteland, and people start to experience drought from that, eventually leads to a famine. So a famine is basically extreme scarcity of food. We've seen famines throughout history. It's something that's of biblical proportions in which people starve to death. It's a little known fact that right now in the world that we're living in, it seems like a world of excess, at least for us Americans, where we waste literally 40% of the food that we consume. Every hour, 700 children die of starvation worldwide. This is a terrible death. It's not like they'd been injured or killed. They slowly waste away to nothing from starvation. So this is a very real thing that's occurring today in the world that we can observe and we've seen throughout history. Nearly every American is completely dependent on food that is shipped in from large farming operations in other states and countries. Most American cities and most Americans are not self-reliant. Needless to say, their entire cities are not self-reliant. These are dependent upon huge distributions and networks of foods and goods and services from outside of the state or outside of the country, and that's where they get their food and their water. If these distribution centers are interrupted or there's a severe drought and food no longer grows, it very quickly becomes a serious situation in most cities where there's only 3 days worth of food on the grocery shelves. So drought can lead to famine, famine can lead to starvation. It's a very real threat in America where most people just don't have what it takes to survive. The average grocery store in America only has these 3 days worth of food in circulation at any time. In bigger cities, it's even worse. They estimate that some bigger cities like New York and the West Coast, California, only have 2 to 3 hours worth of food on their shelves. You can go to a grocery store and they're in a constant state of stocking the shelves. In a mass panic and a rush and a run on the shelves, you see those shelves emptied within hours, literally. There's been several circumstances where big hurricanes have hit, big storms have hit, terrorism has taken place, people rush to the grocery stores, and in a matter of hours, they're empty. There's nothing on the shelves. It's pretty startling to see the effects of famine. Not only does famine lead you to starvation, but after your body starts to starve and it starts to eat its own muscles and to consume itself in order to stay alive, you get to a point where you can't even go and gather food. You can't even get up and walk around and take care of yourself. It's a downward spiral that eventually leads to death. This is an illustration from a deadly famine that took place in India. A couple of facts about famine. Famine is a widespread scarcity of food caused by several factors, including crop failure, population unbalance, or government policies. We've actually seen a couple circumstances where failed government policies have left people in a state of famine and starvation and a lack of food just because they couldn't get the food to the people, or they couldn't get the correct jobs in place where people could produce the food. So we even see people in economies where people are unemployed and they have no food, which makes no sense. If you don't have a job, you should be outgrowing food at the very least. This phenomenon is usually accompanied or followed by regional malnutrition, starvation, epidemics, and increased mortality. So the effects of a famine in which in many cases you're being slowly weaned off of food and starved to death. Not to the point of death immediately, but slowly and surely you're just getting barely enough to survive, barely enough to survive, barely enough to survive. There's little bits of food that don't have the base essentials of vitamins and minerals that you need. It's people chewing on leather and sticks and grass and roots and whatever they can dig up. They start to face a lot of different malnutritions and a lot of increased mortality from the diseases and the shutdown of their internal organs that take place. Famines throughout history have been known to kill tens of millions of people. This is a scary scene right here where you get to the grocery store just hours after an emergency or a disaster or a terrorist attack, and you see that there's nothing on the shelves. They've been completely wiped out or run on the markets. Pandemics. Pandemics often occur on a global outbreak. It's usually determined by how the disease spreads, not how many deaths it causes. So even something like Ebola that killed in the thousands recently in Africa was considered a pandemic because it spread globally. It didn't matter how many people were killed by it. The scary part about a pandemic is that it spreads very quickly from person to person, sometimes from animal to person, and it can affect people on a global scale. When a new influenza A virus emerges, a flu pandemic can occur. Because the virus is new, the human population has little to no immunity against it. These are new viruses that can come out, such as H1N1 or the swine flu, that people have never encountered before, so their immune systems are completely susceptible to it. There's no antibodies, there's no antivirus, there's no kind of a vaccine that you can get that can quickly spread like a wildfire and cause mass amounts of people to become sick and spread it to others and possibly even die. Good example was the Ebola outbreak in Africa, North Africa, and then eventually throughout the world. A couple facts about pandemics. Some of the worst pandemics in history. Let's look at the Black Death. The Black Death plague was one of the worst in history. In a time when the global population was an estimated 450 million, the estimated death tolls were as high as 200 million. Almost half of the entire world population was killed. Think about that today in a world with nearly 7 billion people if 3.5 billion were to die from an epidemic. 80% of some strains of deadly viruses today are resistant to 3 or more different classes of drugs. things that are antibiotic resistant. We're seeing a lot more of that because of a multitude of reasons, normal mutation, but sometimes it's an abuse of antibiotics where antibiotics are overused in circumstances where they don't need to be or not used properly. Even people themselves, not doctors necessarily, but people can misuse antibiotics by not taking them for the full course. It's not like an aspirin. If you have antibiotics, you need to take it for the full course so that it can have its effect. If you take it and you think you're feeling better after 2 days, you can actually contribute to or create an antibiotic-resistant bug. Now the bug is given a chance to rebound from the antibiotics because they're no longer in your system. The bug then studies the antibiotic or builds some kind of resistance towards it, and now you've created an antibiotic-resistant whatever it is that you have, and you're very easily going to get more and more sick. So something that we have to keep in mind is these pandemics can take place. You can't necessarily rely on medicine. A lot of modern medicines are ineffective against some of these terrible diseases. Here's a good example of what's called zoologic or zoonosis types of infections. Sometimes there are infections that spread from animal to humans and then can get out of hand. Some of the worst swine flus and bird influenzas were originally inside of the animal, not known to be affecting humans. And at some point, a mutation occurred. The infection passed zoologically between animal and human, and the humans then became infected by that virus. So there's a lot of viruses out there that right now, some of the scariest of which would be something like rabies or parvo, don't affect human beings. But there could come a time at which these different types of viruses mutate and are able to infect human beings and then also communicable so that they can be spread between humans, either through contact or maybe even through airborne transmission and cause a global pandemic. So recessions and depressions are something else that we need to be prepared to survive for. These are considered emergencies, sometimes a state of national emergency, in which our economy has failed. People lose jobs, people lose their savings, lose their money, their ability to provide for their families, to even buy food to eat. So it's very important to have some kind of food storage, some kind of resource storage to ensure that if there is a recession, if there is a depression, if you were to lose your job, or if you still have your job and maybe the paycheck doesn't clear because the economy is in upheaval, that you're able to survive, that you can put food on the table, that you have water to drink. If the after effects of a recession or a depression take place, even with the municipal water supply or with local utilities companies and your utilities fail, you're going to want to be able to survive in those circumstances. Following the bursting of the housing bubble in mid-2007, the U.S. entered a severe recession. A lot of people likened it to the Depression. The United States entered 2008 during a housing market correction and subprime mortgage crisis. The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars in debt in quantitative easing to end the trend. Now we have a dollar bubble. So basically what they did is they bought some of this volatile stock. They bailed out the big banks at the expense of the taxpayer and created a huge flux of money that they could put into the system and buy up that, and in essence made a dollar bubble out of the housing bubble. Here's a good map that shows the impact index of the Great Recession. Great Recession that took place in late 2008. The states in red had the highest impact, while the states in blue had the lowest impact. And this impact would be on a multitude of different levels, not only economic status, but scarcity of resources, scarcity of jobs. It affects every facet of society, including all the way down to quality of services. Not only quality of government services, but even the quality of the school services that your children have. If they can pay more teachers, the classroom sizes are smaller. It affects pretty much every aspect of our lives in America during a Great Recession. A couple of facts about recession and depression. When the Great Depression reached its peak, some 13 to 15 million Americans were unemployed. That's nearly 20%. And nearly half of the country's banks had completely failed. With banks, of course, went mortgages, businesses. It was a complete collapse of our economy. The economy would not fully turn around until after 1939, when World War II kicked the American industry into high gear. That is a little bit of a warning sign when you see that we're starting to go into a recession or depression, because a lot of times the only thing that works to pull us out of a recession or depression is to kickstart the industrial complex, and a lot of times that's the military industrial complex. And when you see a real recession and a real depression, when you see economic collapse and worries and woes, it's a sign that we're likely leading to war. But there could be some kind of conflict that's real or not necessarily realized. It can be imagined, that the government will focus on, that the banks will focus on in order to get us out of the recession and to get the industrial complex working. So always keep that in mind, that when we face these type of economic collapses and problems, that a lot of times worldwide conflicts come into place. Other countries definitely don't take it lightly when we can't pay our debts, when we become insolvent or bankrupt. So they can threaten us, and we can feel threatened, and it might lead to even further conflicts in the world. Civil unrest. Civil unrest is an emergency that you definitely want to be prepared for in the bigger cities and even in some of the smaller towns. It can take place from any of the other disasters that we've seen. So this is kind of a sub-disaster or sub-emergency, in which one emergency leads to another emergency, where people don't have food, people don't have water, people don't have jobs, they don't have justice, they don't have security, and it could be just social security, not necessarily like a social security payment, but the security that comes from a good economy, the security that comes from a stable government, a stable country. And when they don't have these things, a lot of times you see that it can lead to civil unrest, it can lead to rioting, it can lead to looting, it can lead to a general sense of without rule of law. So civil unrest can actually leave a community paralyzed for weeks at a time. Looting and riots quickly ensue during tough times and political scandal, and it doesn't even take tough times and political scandal. We've seen people fight over faulty arrests or social injustice, racial disparity, over football games and soccer games. People can become unruly, and they get that mob mentality, and if you're in that area, you're at risk. Sometimes things like martial law can ensue, which we've seen in recent years, in which whole communities are shut down, and you need to have the resources on hand to either survive in place, shelter in place, or to get out of town and get somewhere safe and make sure that you're able to take care of yourself and your family. During times of blackouts and brownouts, home invasions actually increase up to 80%. So if the power goes out for whatever reason, it could be the electrical grid goes down, it could be a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake. During those times when people are desperate, home invasions increase, civil unrest increases, and you need to be able to protect yourself, your family, and also to survive during that period of time. A lot of violence, a lot of fires, a lot of shootings, home invasions. In a country and in bigger cities where people have a lot of different disturbances and don't have a lot of resources, they become desperate really quickly. You have to be able to protect yourself. You don't want to be one of those people that is desperate on the street, looting and rioting and in the middle of the chaos to try to survive and get the food and the water and the medicine that you might need for yourself and your family. A couple of facts about civil unrest. With crippling debt, we're printing over $85 billion a month to keep the economy from collapsing. So our debt is increasing substantially on a magnitude that's almost incalculable, over $10,000 per second. Moral decline and the fascism that now exists within our federal government is epidemic. We're seeing not only just a moral decline in general, in which people are more and more attuned to violence. We see sporadic outbursts of violence around the country, mass shootings, school shootings, shootings in stores, shootings in movie theaters, where you never know when you're going to be safe, when you're going to need to protect yourself. You basically have to walk around with a constant state of awareness in order to be sure that you can survive. Mass populations are barely surviving from government check to government check in the welfare states of America. We've got mass amounts of people, millions and millions of people that are just getting by on government checks. They're just living even on their own paycheck, from paycheck to paycheck. They don't have any kind of food storage, they don't have any kind of second plan, no backup plan. If any kind of disaster does hit for a matter of days or weeks, they're going to be desperate, they're going to be violent, they're going to be looking to get what you have, what you hopefully have if you're well prepared. Thank you for watching How to Survive for 3 weeks. Be sure to tune in for our other series on how to survive for 3 days or 3 years.